All right, then. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to round two of this series of lectures on art. This evening, we're talking about accelerationism and vampires. And this will follow on from this first lecture we did on Mark Fisher and his early work, his PhD thesis. So if you haven't watched that video, I encourage you to go and watch it. It'll give you a bit more background to this. However, we are going to recap the points made in that video just quickly here, if the slide is going to change. So, here's one of the quotes from Mark Fisher's PhD thesis, where he's talking about what he calls hypernaturalism, which is what he thinks of as being a new, you could say, paradigm of art or culture that has emerged in, say, the late 20th going into the 21st centuries. So, talking about Frederick Jameson, the famous critic of postmodernism. In Jameson's version, the original naturalist texts were those in which the lower depths, the forbidden spaces of the new industrial city, were disclosed to a horrified bourgeois readership in the form of perilous journeys and accounts of the pathetic destinies of the various underclasses, which you could read about in your comfortable armchair, and that thereby offered the double bonus of sympathy and knowledge of the social totality on the one hand, and class reconfirmation and satisfaction of the bourgeois order on the other. In other words, 19th century realism, of which this artwork behind is an example, gave the audience a window into the miseries of ordinary people without them actually being involved with them themselves. It was still the wealthy, it was still the new urban elite who were watching and witnessing and even enjoying and feeling themselves confirmed in the fact that they were seeing it, as opposed to being involved in looking at, say, romantic art, which had more of a expressive and heroic quality to it. We move forwards to this quote, however, from Jameson about cyberpunk society or postmodern society, which is a bit different. Today, the proletarian, the lumpen and their cousins, the urban criminal, the male, and the prostitute, female, those secure characterizations of the older bourgeois and naturalist imaginary representations of society, which we were just talking about in the 19th century, have today, in postmodernity and cyberpunk, given way to a youth culture in which the urban punks are merely the opposite numbers to the business yuppies. There is now a circulation and recirculation possible between the underworld and the overworld of high-rent condos and lofts. Falling from the latter into the former is no longer so absolute and irrevocable a disaster. Above all, since, offering a knowledge of what used to be called the streets, it can be useful for survival in the unimaginable spaces of corporate and bureaucratic decision. Cyberpunk then supersedes naturalism by registering the meltdown of the social machines in which naturalism both emerged out of and represented. Of course, in the background here, we have a picture of a rave in Berlin. And you probably know people who are in this scene, and they're very often upper middle class, wealthy people, although they dress and do drugs like they're in the gutter. There is this fluid moving from the very bottom into the very top, and an obsession with both. We then, in that video, went to look at Mark Fisher's writing about David Cronenberg's Videodrome, a film which seems to dramatize this breaking down of the stable categories of society, and indeed of man and machine and man and other. And this film is an investigation of the way that the eroticization of media becomes increasingly seductive, sucking the protagonist literally into his television and making him almost into one with his psychotic imaginary of the machine. Fisher writes about Cronenberg's film like this. In Libidinal Economy and Duchamp's Transformers, Lyotard suggests the ways in which such body horror, like this movie, might be a realist description of late capitalism. Bodies under capitalism are not alienated, he insists, but machined, transformed, mutated, something Jameson recognizes in his discussion of Cronenberg's Videodrome in the geopolitic aesthetic. But Jameson, hung up on Adorno's dialecto-melancholy, interesting term, is far too quick there when he argues that the corporeal revulsion arising from Videodrome's grotesquely sexual nightmare images, in which males are feminized by the insertion of organic cassettes, if not revolvers, into a newly opened dripping slot below the breastbone, probably has the primary function of expressing fears about activity and passivity in the complexities of late capitalism, and is only secondarily invested with the level of gender itself. End quote. I should have mentioned that passage there was a quote. By implying that feminization must always be equated by pacification, itself a second-order effect of late capitalism, Jameson begs all the questions Videodrome poses in its positing of a convergent fate for sex, technology, and capital. Okay, what the fuck does this mean? Essentially, Fisher here, and this is the young Fisher, is criticizing Jameson's reading of Videodrome, of turning it into a parable about capitalism and late capitalism, or we could say neoliberal capitalism, which increasingly takes on an autonomous character and submits, and you could say pacifies or makes passive, makes men and women passive in the face of it. Fisher here is saying, no, the film asks us to consider something more, in a sense, strange and horrific. If human sexuality and desire is itself entangled with this thing in more of a positivistic, intensive way, that's very influenced by Deleuze in the thinking here, that it's not just that it's capitalism destroying natural human ways of behaving or natural human hierarchies. It's humans being sucked into recursive feedback loops by their own erotic machinery. And why this is interesting, and this types into the previous video as well, is that the precise move that Mark Fisher is accusing Jameson of here is exactly what he falls into in his later work after his PhD thesis. Mark Fisher writes capitalist realism and then becomes very much entangled in what I think he called there Adorno's dialecto-melancholy, where he's writing about capitalism and how there's nothing beyond capitalism. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And his work takes on much more of a depressive strain than it did in the 90s. If you're familiar with some of his other later work, so for example, Ghosts of My Life, the thesis there, picking up from Derrida's idea of ontology, is that we keep repeating 20th century culture because we're stuck in it. And our culture, that culture, carried the pregnancy of some kind of better world, a communist world or a socialist world or a more united world, the 60s, the 70s, punk music, hippie music, rock music. It pointed towards something beyond. And that world never arrived. And so we're stuck looping it. And it's a legitimate point. If you think about, we are constantly churning out these biopics about Bob Dylan or Bruce Springsteen or Freddie Mercury. The 20th century gets rehashed and recycled and rechurned, whereas 21st century culture struggles to pick up in the same way. It remains very underground. We keep worshipping the icons of the 20th century. But, and here's the crucial point, that's not the only story. There is stuff happening, but it seems to me like Fisher himself recoiled from that. Because what comes out, and this is the whole thrust of the CCRU work and the PhD thesis we're looking at, and Nick Land's work and other stuff, is that there is this convergence of technology, sexuality, as we mentioned in the previous slide, also esotericism and occultism that's coming together, or at least can come together in ways that are a cybermancy, for example, which is very different to endless Bob Dylan reruns. So I found this funny meme of we fucking on the Fisher bed tonight, guys, because there's more to the picture, especially once we dive into Mark Fisher's PhD thesis, and as we will find in this lecture today, also into the nexus that produced that PhD thesis. And I think this is the crucial thing. And just to tease, we are going to start to consider the relationship between Nick Land and Mark Fisher in the 90s. presenting a thesis that I've been working with in my head for a year or so that provides a pretty interesting and strange way to think about accelerationism. But in order to do that, we are going to need to take a very weird detour through Camille Paglia and English Romantic poetry, Wordsworth and Coleridge. So, buckle up. Here we are with Camille Paglia. For people who don't know my work, it tends to be, I think, a fusion of Camille Paglia's art theory and the work of the CCRU, Nick Land and Mark Fisher particularly. And then more recently also we've been sprinkling Oswald Spengler into the mix, which I think we might talk about in a future video. But so people know where I'm coming from, and when you might or might not have heard of the group Dark Renaissance Productions, that's something that I've been part of founding. We're an artist collective, really. We do immersive theatre, and it's obviously a riff on the Dark Enlightenment that comes from Nick Land and Curtis Yarvin, but it's not an uncritical engagement with the Dark Enlightenment, as we shall see. Anyway, so Camille Paglia, art theorist from the 1960s. That's how she credits herself. She's a 60s woman. She's a lesbian. She was very popular in the 90s, glamorous, provocative, identifies as a libertarian leftist. But if we check out these quotes here from a far-right publication, she's also not exactly left. At least people on the extreme right find her kind of interesting. So, her views are deliberately paradoxical and complicated, Nietzschean in a sense, deliberately designed to outrage contemporary campus opinion, intellectual androgynes, and the politically correct. She is a populist reaction to the closing of the American mind, which has proceeded apace since the 1950s in the American academic world, where French theory slowly started to seep in. The essential point of Camille Paglia's thesis in Sexual Personae is that the de-Europeanization of intellectual life in the United States, first the desire to pretend that culture is non-hierarchical and non-elitist posture, where petromusicology, the academic study of rock music, is treated on an equal level to Bruckner, a situation where the lyrics of Meatloaf's Bat Out of Hell are treated on a par with the mordant dithyrambics of Aeschylus's or Asteia. Paglia and Bloom, her mentor, in their very different ways, he, sullen post-Mencken academic elitist, she, an American version of Julie Burchill on acid, that's interesting, are complaining about the sordidness and racial proletarianism of the American intellect. What they really object to is the counter-intellectual philistinism of the political correctness movement, which has been latched onto by psychological inadequates among the jeunesse dorée in American college life. So as I said, Camille Paglia is someone who's in this libertarian cultural 60s left space. That she's also appealing to people who defend the European tradition and the hierarchical tradition of our culture and don't want to see it melted away into some kind of multicultural communist goop. Something very interesting, and we'll probably have to do another video on this, as I mentioned, I discovered that for the 1950s beat poets in America, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and those guys who were pretty foundational for what came later with the 60s psychedelic counterculture. Oswald Spengler, the German traditionalist philosopher, was a huge influence on them, which is very strange if you think of this German conservative philosopher looping his way around into the psychedelic counterculture. We'll unpack that next time, but that just goes to show that these blocks left, right, as we tend to think about them today, are not so rigidly fixed, especially when you put them up against other things, other distinctions, you could say, between the high cultural ambition and a leveling egalitarian ambition. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about Coleridge and we're going to talk about Wordsworth. So on the left, you have William Wordsworth. On the right, you have Samuel Taylor Coleridge. First thing I notice when I look at them, Wordsworth is obviously the more striking and handsome figure. Strong cheekbones, strong forehead, strong nose. Coleridge, by contrast, is a bit pudgy, a bit chubby, a bit ugly. They're both brilliant and they're both close friends, both almost exactly the same age. Although, as we shall see, Coleridge was very much the student of Wordsworth. And this plays out in his poetry. Perhaps you can already get an inkling of what I'm starting to play with. Perhaps you can't. but you'll have to stay tuned. Anyway, so we're going to read some of their poetry and also look at Camille Paglia's analysis of their poetry through the lens of sexual personae, which is her thesis based in Nietzsche, Freud, James Frazer, about the erotics and the poetics and the esoterics of poetry and art. So here's a poem by William Wordsworth, which, irritatingly, my thing at the top of the screen, hide video, nope, hide floating meeting controls. There we go. Right. Expostulation and Reply by William Wordsworth. Why, William, on that old grey stone, thus for the length of half a day? Why, William, sit you thus alone, and dream your time away? Where are your books that light bequeath to beings else forlorn and blind? Up, up, and drink the spirit breathed from dead men to their kind. You look round on your mother earth as if she bore no purpose for you, as if you were her firstborn birth, and none had lived before you. One morning thus by Estwith Lake, when life was sweet, I knew not why, to me my good friend Matthew spake, thus I made my reply. So that was all someone speaking to William. Quoth William, the eye it cannot choose but see, we cannot bid the ear be still. Our bodies feel where'er they be, against or with our will. Nor less I deem that there are powers which of themselves our minds impress, that we can feed this mind of ours in a wise passiveness. Think you, mid all this mighty sum of things forever speaking, that nothing of itself will come, but we must still be seeking? Then ask not wherefore here alone, conversing as I may, I sit upon this old grey stone and dream my time away. Now what we see here in this poem is the expostulator, the questioner, Mr. Matthew, asking Wordsworth, where are your books? Where is your interest in your lineage? Very masculine questions. What are you doing sitting, whiling your time away, gazing at the sky and doing, as William himself says, being passive and being just open to receive? And William replies, exalting the virtues of this passiveness, especially for poet, for wise passiveness, powers that impress themselves on our minds that he seeks. What does Paglia say about it? Wordsworth's first principle is wise passiveness, a feminine receptivity opening us to nature. In Expostulation and Reply from Wordsworth and Coleridge's revolutionary lyrical ballads, told you they were friends, a friend chides the poet for dreaming his time away. Wordsworth replies that the eye sees, the ear hears, and our bodies feel against or with our will. Unknown powers play upon us. These powers are chthonian. But Wordsworth severs them from their ancient connection to sex and barbarism. This is Paglia through and through. Reality is active, the poet contemplative, dominated by nature. The poem is a manifesto of sexual dissent, a withdrawal from the traditional masculine sphere of action and achievement, his book, his lineage. It starts a movement in modern literature leading to Melville's self-entombed Bartleby, I would prefer not to, and Kafka's crippled cockroach, Gregor Samsa. Wordsworth forfeits maleness for spiritual union with Mother Nature, wholeness through self-mutilation. His poetry revives the ritualism of the Asiatic mother cults, whose priests castrated themselves for the goddess. Bold words, but Paglia's argument is that Wordsworth, in painting a beautiful and idle picture of nature, one that the poet and the imaginative and the contemplative can plug himself into and relax in and absorb beautifully, it might feel fantastic, but it's also an emasculating gesture. It removes the struggle inherent in life and in nature by repressing it. Another poem by Wordsworth, The World. The world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We've given our hearts away, a sordid boon. This sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling all the hours. and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn. So might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. A beautiful picture of the world, but one in which man is exhausted. We lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature. We've given our hearts away. Meanwhile, nature is given this motherly, erotic but motherly tone, the sea that bears her bosom to the moon. The winds are howling, but they're gathered now like flowers. The moment it gets too harsh, it's gentled again. He paints this image of a pagan suckled, not a pagan sacrificing and who must be repressed or oppressed by Christian virtue. No, a pagan suckling like a babe. He listened to the tone of this poem as well. It's very soft, very soothing, very gentle. It could be a lullaby. Paglia writes about him. The poet is a gentle creature with a female mind, happiest when sitting brooding like a mother dove. At Cambridge, Wordsworth was as sensitive to nature's changes as waters to the sky. He was obedient as a lute, waiting for the touches of the wind. That's from Prelude. Wordsworth often calls river or sea a female bosom or breast. We saw some of that in this poem. So if he is water, which he did just claim previously, he is female, as in ancient cosmologies which imagine female earth inseminated by male sky. Erotic passivity is implicit in Romanticism's favourite topos of the Aeolian wind harp. Here a lute symbolising the artist's subordination to nature's inspiring power. So here Paglia frames this romantic gesture encapsulated by Wordsworth, who in many senses is seen as the patriarch of Romanticism, certainly the English Romantic poets, in his wise passivity, in his making himself soft and gentle to receive his soft and gentle nature. I'm going to have a sip of water, funnily enough. I have received it. Paglia goes on. He sees nature with Rousseau's eyes. That's Rousseau who wrote The Social Contract, which is widely regarded as having inspired the French Revolution and being, depending on who you ask, a real statement in the history of the enlightenment of mankind, or a deluded document that has basically led to the Jacobin horrors and the communist horrors, people believing that men can hold hands and live side by side peacefully together. Paglia says, Wordsworth's refusal to acknowledge the sex or cruelty in nature is one source of the palpable repression in his poetry, which constricts and weighs it down. This repression, approaching depressiveness, accounts for Wordsworth's lack of appeal to young readers, who are drawn to energy, not to mention lust. Wordsworth's sexlessness is not neurotic failing, but conceptual strategy. He must renounce sex in order not to see or feel nature's sadism. And Paglia is right. If you pick up a volume of Wordsworth, it's beautiful poetry. It's stunning. He's a master, undoubtedly. It is turgid, however. There's a grey-green hue, similar to the colour on the screen, actually. And it's page after page of this slow and pretty, but not that much happens. A lot of his characters, especially his male characters, are elderly and decrepit and looking out as if they've lived a life or as if they have no desire to live a life. There's no masculine vigor in the characters of Wordsworth. And Paglia is suggesting that this is part of his strategy, in that he has to actually deny this part of life in order to paint his beautiful images of nature. Another poem of Wordsworth, and this will be our final one of his. This is the famous one that begins, I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. So, again, an exhortation of the beauty and the peace and the slowness of nature, and walking and winding one's way gently and being joyous and relaxed or vacant or pensive, alone. This is all that comes out when we're reading Wordsworth. And now we move on to the student, Coleridge. Already, just look at these images if you're looking. Slightly more erotic already, Mr. Ugly Wordsworth. We'll just say here, and this is important, we will come back to this, and this does point forward as well, as I mentioned. Coleridge did his best work under Wordsworth's influence. After they separated, Coleridge languished poetically and never matched his early achievements. This is true. If you go and read Coleridge, Coleridge has 2 or 3 masterpieces, 2 of which we'll read today, excerpts from. And then he's got a lot that is crap, or mediocre, you could say. And at the same time, the visionary pieces are so visionary, they're so unique and striking and potent that that doesn't matter. So let's read some of Christabel, one of his most famous poems. And while we go through this, I want you to notice, remember, even passages in Christabel are pretty bad, as if they could have been written by a 7-year-old, and yet it still resounds. And especially in this little first bit, pay attention to that, because you could have written some of this. You probably could have if you were just sitting there at home with your notebook. So we'll read quite a lot of this poem, not all of it, and it's a long narrative poem, so it will be excerpts. I do recommend you go and read the whole thing, actually. Is the night chilly and dark? The night is chilly, but not dark. The thin grey cloud is spread on high. It covers, but not hides, the sky. The moon is behind and at the full, and yet she looks both small and dull. The night is chill, the cloud is grey, 'tis a month before the month of May, and the spring comes slowly up this way. Truly inspired. The lovely lady Christabel, whom her father loves so well, what makes her in the wood so late? A furlong from the castle gate. She had dreams all yesternight of her own betrothed knight, and she in the midnight wood will pray for the weal of her lover that's far away. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. So we've got the lovely lady Christabel wandering in the woods late. We know she's betrothed, but it's dark. There she sees a damsel bright, dressed in a silken robe of white, that shadowy in the moonlight shone, the neck that made that white robe one. Her stately neck and arms were bare, her blue-veined feet unsandaled were, and wildly glittered here and there the gems entangled in her hair. I guess 'twas frightful there to see a lady so richly clad as she, beautiful exceedingly. Mary, mother, save me now, said Christabel, and who art thou? The lady strange made answer meet, and her voice was faint and sweet. Have pity on my sore distress, I can scarce speak for weariness. So there's a strange encounter between the women in the woods. Beautiful stranger. So what happens in the meantime is that Christabel takes this mysterious lady back to her castle, and they take her in because she seems to have been the victim of some horrible crime. And then they recline into the same bedroom together. And Geraldine is the name of the woman who has been found in the woods, and she's now undressing. So this is Christabel who's lying on the bed. So halfway from the bed she rose, and on her elbow did recline, to look at the Lady Geraldine. Beneath the lamp the lady bowed, and slowly rolled her eyes around. Then drawing in her breath aloud, like one that shuddered, she unbound the cincture from beneath her breast. Her silken robe and inner vest dropped to her feet, and full in view, behold her bosom and half her side, a sight to dream of, not to tell. Oh, shield her! Shield sweet Christabel! Geraldine nor speaks nor stirs. Ah, what a stricken look was hers! Deep from within she seems halfway to lift some weight with sick essay, and eyes the maid and seeks delay. Then suddenly, as one defied, collects herself in scorn and pride, and lay down by the maiden's side, and in her arms the maid she took. Ah, well a day! And with low voice and doleful look, these words did say. In the touch of this bosom there worketh a spell, which is lord of thy utterance, Christabel. Thou knowest tonight, and will know tomorrow, this mark of my shame, this seal of my sorrow. But vainly thou warrest, for this in alone in thy power to declare, that in the dim forest thou heardst the low moaning, and found a bright lady surpassingly fair. Thou didst bring her home with thee in love and in charity, to shield her and shelter her from the damp air. And then in the morning, Christabel awoke and spied the same who lay down by her side, or rather say the same whom she raised up beneath the old oak tree, nay, fairer yet, and yet more fair, for she beliketh drunken deep of all the blessedness of sleep. And while she spake, her looks, her air, such gentle thankfulness declared, that, so it seemed, her girded vest grew tight between her heaving breasts. Sure I have sinned, said Christabel. Now heaven be praised if all be well. And then we'll just pause here for a moment before moving on, because this is the way this poem works, is that it's a bit like a mystery novel or a detective story, in that this happens and we get this sense that this woman has been found in the woods. She's come to bed to Christabel, and something monstrous has happened, and we don't quite know what. And Christabel herself is at least unsure or not being completely clear with what's happened, but we know something has transpired between them, and that when Geraldine undressed, there was something monstrous about her. Now, later, moving on, Christabel's father takes Geraldine in his arms. This is later in the day. And fondly in his arms he took fair Geraldine, who met the embrace, prolonging it with joyous look, which when she viewed, a vision fell upon the soul of Christabel, the vision of fear, the touch, the pain. She shrunk and shuddered, and saw again. Ah, woe is me! Was it for thee, thou gentle maid, such sights to see? Again she saw that bosom old. Again she saw that, or felt that bosom cold, and drew in her breath with a hissing sound. So as Geraldine, or rather Christabel, sees her father embrace Geraldine in the castle, she's struck with these flashes of recollection of what had happened the night before. So Paglia tells us, this poem is a study of the tension between imagination and morality. Through it, we follow a great poet into his excess of demonic vision, and then out again into the social realm of humane good wishes, where the visionary is beset by doubt, anxiety, and guilt. Christabel shows the birth of poetry in evil, hostility, and crime. I do advise you to read the rest of the poem, but it's precisely, we've seen some crucial parts, as I mentioned. It's a bit of a detective story. It's it's a gothic vampire detective story, you could say, and we get so close to seeing what happens, but also not completely. We don't see it completely, but again, there's these signs of guilt, even as people try to pretend that nothing has happened. And there's something monstrous about Geraldine. We move on to another poem of Wordsworth. We won't read it in the same length at all. We'll just mention it, which is the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. This line: God save the ancient mariner from the fiends that plague these Thee thus. Why look'st thou so with my crossbow? I shot the albatross. Famous images, if you know this poem. It's about a sailor on a boat that gets stranded in the middle of the ocean and his crew die and he's beset by visions of demons rising up out of the waves. As a side note, it's inspired poets and artists for centuries. Iron Maiden, the famous British heavy metal band, have one of their most popular songs is called Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Here you see Bruce Dickinson, the frontman, singing before this backdrop of an old and molded ship stranded in the middle of the ocean. You can see a bit of the lyrics, right? Death and she, life and depth, they throw their dice for the crew. She wins the Mariner, and he belongs to her now. Then crew one by one, they drop down dead, 200 men. She, life in death. She lets him live, her chosen one. This is Iron Maiden, not Coleridge, but it's similar themes to Christabel, you see. This monstrous apparition, this feminine apparition that has risen, in this case, out of the waves to attack the poor sailor. So this is Paglia writing about Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Language is mutilated for vision in the Ancient Mariner. Thus the appeal to good has a backlash effect, sparking the birth of evil. Invocation of Christ's name fails to release the mariner from his imprisonment in ocean's nightmare womb. When a sail appears on the horizon, there is a moment of hope and joy. The mariner attempts a new prayer. Heaven's mother, send us grace! Hail Mary. But sacred language is profaned by demonic revelation. On the ship is the grossest female apparition. This from the poem. Her lips were red, her looks were free. Her locks were yellow as gold. Her skin was white as leprosy. The light nightmare life in death was she, who thicks man's blood with cold. Pure Gothic horror. Appeals to sky cult are useless. As if irritated by reference to her benign successor, the tender Madonna, the Mother, makes her sensational appearance. But she is the whore of Babylon, the daemon unbound. Her lips are red with provocation and the blood of her victims. She is all health and all disease. Those lines, skin as white as leprosy, is one of the most striking in all of English language. She is a mask of red death, a Medusa who turns men to stone, but also the mother who stirs the blood pudding of her sons till their bodies congeal in her womb. To give life is to kill. This is heaven's mother who comes when called. She is the vampire who haunts men's dreams. I've got a couple of pictures of the next bit that Paglia quotes so we can visualize it even more. She's the vampire who haunts men's dreams. Aubrey Beardsley depicts a Coleridgean epiphany of the vampire Madonna in the Ascension of St. Rose of Lima. This we see on the right-hand side here, with this black goddess raising the saint up from the land where we see churches and hills into this. The saint is rising what seems a very affectionate embrace, whereas this dark goddess has something of a pagan Isis to her. She's not a gentle Mother Mary, that's for sure. Another monstrous epiphany occurs in Ingmar Bergman's Through a Glass Darkly, where a mad girl sees God as a sexually aggressive spider. I think this sexually aggressive spider image is particularly interesting. It shows up again and again, more recently, actually, in a Netflix show called Love, Death and Robots, where one of the most striking episodes is about really a sailor, funnily enough. It's the Rime of the Ancient Mariner again, although he's a space traveler this time, who winds up in this station on the outskirts of known space, and he's trapped, and he thinks that he's found an old friend and lover of his, but then he seems to actually have been ensnared by this spiderous monster. We spoke a little bit about H.R. Geiger last time. I just wanted to put this painting in here of his because it rhymes very nicely with the images we have here. This overlapping of spidery technology, tentacles, and suction and horror and death and intense feminine sensuality. Interestingly enough, as well, while I was digging, I thought about Shelob from The Lord of the Rings, the spider. And I discovered that in a recent Lord of the Rings video game, they decided to turn Shelob into a beautiful and glamorous woman. Just funny how those archetypes show up. Anyway, back to our main track. So, we've been talking about Wordsworth and Coleridge, and I hope you can see that in terms of their poetry, it's such a striking difference. Wordsworth is celebrates a beautiful, peaceful, placid nature, but if you go with Paglia's argument, he does so at the expense of his own vitality. He becomes weary and alone, solitudinous, and he's okay with that, but he wanders grey. His characters are tired and weary, and they see the world as a beautiful pagan suckling bosom ocean, throwing words around. But you read the poem with me. Coleridge, by contrast, in his great works Christabel and the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, despite their often dodgy moments, paints these visions of men stranded in the middle of the ocean, or women beset by vampiric apparitions in forests, which then come home with them and prey on them in ways that he can't even tell us how. And it's Coleridge, those visions, that seem to be showing up again in our 20th and 21st century culture, as I mentioned. Now, the two of them, close friends, contemporaries. Let's go back to that quote we read from Paglia earlier, but expand on it this time. Coleridge did his best work under Wordsworth's influence. After they separated, Coleridge languished poetically and never matched his early achievements. The nature of their collaboration was this. Wordsworth was a father/lover who absorbed Coleridge's self-punishing superego and allowed his turbulent dream life to spill directly into his poetry. The supreme irony, as we shall see, is that everything that is great in Coleridge is a negation of Wordsworth. This is the son's ultimate revenge upon the father. Wordsworth's leading and moral idea of nature's benevolence is annihilated in Coleridge. Coleridge sees the Chthonian horror in nature that Wordsworth could not acknowledge. The vampires of Christabel and the Rime of the Ancient Mariner are the true nature mother. Wordsworth reawakened sleeping pagan nature cult, then flew from the spectres he had aroused. How easily Wordsworth was assimilated into bourgeois 19th century culture. His Protestant moralism was his barrier against the daemonic. It is pagan Coleridge, not Protestant Wordsworth, who is the begetter of 19th century archetypal vision. The decadent late romantic line of Poe, Baudelaire, Moreau, Rossetti, Burne-Jones, Swinburne, Pater, Huysman, Beardsley, and Wilde descends directly from Coleridge's mystery poems. By his pregnant servitude to Wordsworth, Coleridge bore monstrous children who would destroy their father. So this is crucial to Paglia's reading of the two of them, that Coleridge had a totally demonic imagination. And the only way he could actually express it was by being under the tutelage of the much more stoic and stern and Protestant, moralistic, languid Wordsworth. You could say, and you can go and read the poetry yourself. You will see that after this period where they were together, it's true, Coleridge's other work does not come anywhere near the fiery intensity of Christabel, of Rime of the Ancient Mariner, where Wordsworth is at least much more consistent. You can read books of his works, and they're all pretty much the same. Wordsworth displaces onto Coleridge what he cannot himself acknowledge in nature. From Coleridge comes the savage line of 19th century pornographic daemonism, Poe and Hawthorne to Baudelaire, Wilde, and James. We already said most of that already, to be fair. The bitter war between Wordsworth and Coleridge goes on for 100 years. Finally, tutelary relationships are filled with sexual ambiguities. Coleridge calls Wordsworth, "O friend, my comforter and guide, strong in thyself and powerful to give strength. But perhaps the teacher is never strong, except in teaching. Perhaps teaching is a kind of vampirism in which mesmerizing assertions of authority drink the energy they arouse." Okay, what the fuck is this long digression about? Well, let's return back to where we started and remember the thesis that I've been presenting all along is that Mark Fisher, in his early work, his CCRU work, his PhD thesis, Gothic Materialism, is a true visionary that opens up a realm of possibilities of art and I think thought and expression that are not matched at all in his later dreary socialist work on capitalist realism. I think that exactly what he accused Jameson of doing, of over determining his analysis by everything, basically capitalism is eating everything, he falls into that. But when did he write the PhD thesis? When did he do the early work? Precisely when he was in the CCRU under the tutelage of Nick Land, who was very much the guru. He was the instigator of the CCRU. He was the man. And I think the thesis that I play with is that there is something of the relationship Coleridge and Wordsworth in Fisher and Land. And this, if we can start to wrap our heads around this, gives us a totally new way to think about what the fuck is going on with, say, post-CCRU, accelerationism, dark enlightenment, and so on. I also invite you to notice that there's even something similar in the ways they look. Land has the more sharp features. He's more handsome. Fisher is more pudgy, uglier, softer looking. So I'm going to present a case for and against because it's not perfect. I'll admit the thesis doesn't match up absolutely, but I think there's reasonable correspondence that we should at least consider it, and you can make up your own mind. So the argument for, as we've mentioned, Nick Land is the guru, Fisher is the student. We know that much. We know that while they worked together in this crazy explosive collaboration that had many other people in it, they created one of the most, probably the most significant piece of philosophy and art theory as a body of work, and even I would say esoteric theory. The body of work of the CCRU from the 90s is remarkable, and it's just starting to be unpacked in literature and on YouTube now, especially now that Nick Land has gone on to create the Dark Enlightenment and become one of the most famous philosophers in the world at this point, and often called the dark philosopher or the dark warlock of Silicon Valley. Fisher, as we've mentioned, has this stunning poetic debut with Flatline Constructs, and then, my opinion, just ironically flatlines, goes into a depressive, melancholic mode, runs away from the demonism and the esotericism of his early work, and instead becomes a depressed socialist, depressed communist, and ends up tragically killing himself. He can't bear the world and the way he looks at it. And none of the poetry, none of the vigor, none of the fire in that early work is in any of his later work, as brilliant as it is. And I really do encourage people to go and get yourself a copy of Flatline Constructs. You can find it online or you can buy it. It's a remarkable fucking text. I know a few people who have watched the first video have actually gotten a copy of it. I'd be curious if any of you are listening to this, what you think about it, because to me, it's stunning. It's so CCRU, but it's also... it's bigger than Nick Land, and that's what I find so fascinating about it. Now, something else that tends to support this case is that Nick Land's work is very interested in coding, zeros and ones and QWERTY keyboards. It's very masculine and analytic in that sense. Not necessarily the most vigorous going to war and conquering, but the sort of the computer programming mindset. where Fisher's work is much more interested in archetypology, in cinema, in music, in the visionary as opposed to the abstract, you could say. And I think there's something in that too, where Fisher, like Coleridge, is much more engaged in the daimonic imaginary, where Nick Land is much more engaged in a kind of distant, abstract, contemplative stance. So this is my case for. The case against, Nick Land was also doing a shit ton of drugs and writing, you could say, quite possessed demonic work at that time as well. He was not the same placid, detached, Wordsworthian character as so much as I can tell. Anyway, however, we do know that in his more recent work in the Dark Enlightenment, Land has explicitly come out as seeing himself as part of the English Puritan tradition and the English Protestant tradition. He loves Milton. He writes about this on X. So there is something in Land that does lean itself towards the Protestant view, even if his work in the 90s was in a somewhat more chaotic, ecstatic, demonic vein. As I said, I leave you to make your own conclusion. It's not a perfect analogy, but I think there is something fascinating to unpack in this relationship between these two figures. And it might as well be said while we're at it that Nick Land on the right and Mark Fisher on the left are two of the most important people in culture today. On the left, probably the only other person who matters as much as Mark Fisher is Slavoj Žižek. And on the right, in terms of philosophers, there's no one of Nick Land's stature who's so famous. There's Curtis Yarvin, who's the other member of Dark Enlightenment, sure, but Yarvin, by contrast, is much more of a technician. And Dark Enlightenment launches with Nick Land writing a commentary on Curtis Yarvin. Another case against would perhaps be that the CCRU is not a dyadic relationship. There were many students within that nexus, of whom we've not spoken about today. Truthfully, I don't know that much about the relationships between the rest of them. None of them are as significant as Land and Fisher in terms of their cultural influence. And finally, I don't know anything about the personal relationship between Land and Fisher. Perhaps it had characteristics that Wordsworth and Coleridge had. Perhaps there was a sense of idealization and closeness. Perhaps they were more distant. However, I think there is something, whether it's Land or whether it's the atmosphere of the CCRU that Land had cultivated at Warwick, allowed Fisher, who by his own admission was something of an awkward, nerdy, quiet, dorky kid, to unleash this imaginary, his imagination in flatline constructs. And the moment that the CCRU was over and he went to being a professor at an English university, he lost that visionary quality. He remained good as a cultural critic. I always talk of him as about the highest achievement that a Guardian critic of art, the Guardian newspaper that is, could achieve. It's very good. His art criticism is fantastic. There's not really anyone in the late 20th and early 21st century, I think, on that level missing, especially when you know what came before. All right, let's start wrapping this up then. So, just as a little nod to the side, actually, if you're interested in this conversation, as I mentioned, Dark Renaissance is where we're exploring this beyond Dark Enlightenment. And I think bringing in a bit more of this Fisherian demonic way of looking at things without just offhandedly negating Dark Enlightenment and going, that's a far right new reactionary movement, bad. We don't like that techno-feudalist, neo-feudalist, whatever, no communism. It's going, no, right, all right, let's think this through more deeply. Let's go, maybe Land himself is recoiling or repressing something that was coming out in the other CCRU work that might now come out in an artistic space, not in a political space, I might mention. And that looks exactly like this. What we've been looking at throughout our discussions of Fisher and Coleridge, this demonic, seductive component of technology and the moment that we're in, rather than just the distancing, the Protestant moralism. Something I forgot to mention on the previous slide, but it's worth mentioning, something Nick Land is often criticized for, despite his cyberpunk visions of AI taking over and essentially replacing humanity as the governing force upon Earth, is that Nick Land tends to align himself with this artificial intelligence, if not as a benevolent force, and at least as the only force worth listening to, as the force of God. You could even say as the force of providence, as capital is a God building itself in the future, or some kind of super intelligence that should be aligned with. And there is something in that of the Wordsworthian also aligning with the benevolence of nature, even if it's a second nature. If we go back to our conversation of hypernaturalism in the previous lecture, even if technology represents a second nature, or man's interaction with technology represents a second nature being born, I've just lost my camera, doesn't matter. Even if it represents a second nature being born, Land's work seems to just ally with that, whereas Fisher's work presents, if we consider again Wordsworth, Coleridge, that there's at least more of a struggle, a tension, a battle, and an erotics, and a violence, and a vampirism, and a demonism within this entity, this being. And I just throw in here this artwork, which is a depiction of Babylon, the Scarlet Woman from Aleister Crowley's Thelema, because there's something in Crowley, I think, as a prophet at the beginning of the 20th century, who intuits this and begins to try and create an esotericism or a magic that accounts for the rise of this, he calls it the Scarlet Woman, this demonic feminine force. And interestingly, this was important for the CCRU, for both Land and for Fisher. Aleister Crowley. They were working out of Crowley's house at one point. And I think we haven't, like with many of these prophets and poets and visionaries, we don't really know what to do with it. It just paints a picture of what we're dealing with, of what we're confronting, and what, especially in the terrain of the arts and the esoteric and the occult, we face and we wrestle with. It's not a moralistic thing. It's beyond, it's outside, as Paglia would say, it's outside of the realm of Protestant morality, of strict codes and rules that we can understand, and benevolent natural forces that we can align with. I threw this in because this came onto my radar as well, just as we close up. Richard Wagner, who created the opera Tannhäuser, which is based on the German myth of Tannhäuser. It's a stunning opera. I go check out. I put in a little clip of Herbert Karajan conducting the overture. It's a fantastic piece of music. It's from the 19th century, but I think this picture depicts again this struggle. So what happens is Tannhäuser, the knight, is ensnared in the realm of Venus, the pagan goddess of love and sensuality. He's in Venusberg beneath the earth, and he tries to escape, and he ultimately goes to the Pope and seeks redemption, and the Pope refuses to redeem him, and eventually he is redeemed by the sacrifice of the human woman who loves him. She has to die in order for him to be redeemed. But I think there's something so stunning and beautiful and and correct that ties in with all these themes that we've been discussing here in this image of her clinging at him. Okay, here she's put in a more of a, she comes across as passive, but he's horrified. Look at him clutching to his sword as the only thing that lifts him up out of the realm of this vampiric feminine, staring up to the sky on his knees, clutching his broadsword. And we can just transpose that with the hypermedia, come to me now, the new flesh, the videodrome, the Scarlet Woman whispering out of the screens, and the man clutching to his sword, begging God to guide him safely through. So this is us really, accelerationism and vampires. What I think is that by reading early Mark Fisher, And especially by reading early Mark Fisher through the light of English Romanticism and looking at the relationship of Wordsworth and Coleridge and transposing that onto the relationship of Nick Land and Mark Fisher, if we are justified in drawing out any conclusions from that, it might be that the early Mark Fisher holds a key, however horrible the key is, to unlocking something about the artistic culture, the visionary culture that is being released by the new political and technological situation that we find ourselves in, and which Nick Land's work and the Dark Enlightenment, with its neo-Protestant bent towards technology and abstraction and artificial intelligence and code, as opposed to cyberpunk and body horror and punk music, even, maybe blind to. And this is not blind to, this is not a left wing critique, as I said, saying dark enlightenment is bad. It's something to be resisted and struggled against from a secular, enlightened, progressive mindset. It's rather a task, a battle of spirit, of art, of the occult forces that we have at our hands. Thank you very much.